The Dutch Golden Age painting is the painting of the Dutch Golden Age, a period in Dutch history generally spanning the 17th century. During and after the later part of the 80 Years' War for Dutch independence, the new Dutch Republic was the most prosperous nation in Europe, and led European trade, science, and art. The northern Netherlandish provinces that made up the new state had traditionally been less important artistic centers than cities in Flanders in the south, and the upheavals and large-scale transfers of population of the war, and the sharp break with the old monarchist and Catholic cultural traditions, meant that Dutch art needed to reinvent itself entirely, a task in which it was very largely successful. Although Dutch painting of the Golden Age comes in the general European period of Baroque painting, and often shows many of its characteristics, most lacks the idealization and love of splendor typical of much Baroque work, including that of neighboring Flanders. Most work, including that for which the period is best known, reflects the traditions of detailed realism inherited from early Netherlandish painting. A distinctive feature of the period is the proliferation of distinct genres of paintings, with the majority of artists producing the bulk of their work within one of these. The full development of this specialization is seen from the late 1620s. And the period from then until the French invasion of 1672 is the core of Golden Age painting. Types of painting. A distinctive feature of the period, compared to earlier European painting, was the small amount of religious painting. Dutch Calvinism forbade religious painting in churches, and though biblical subjects were acceptable in private homes, relatively few were produced. The other traditional classes of history and portrait painting were present, but the period is more notable for a huge variety of other genres, subdivided into numerous specialized categories, such as scenes of peasant life, landscapes, townscapes, landscapes with animals, maritime paintings, flower paintings and still lifes of various types. The development of many of these types of painting was decisively influenced by 17th-century Dutch artists. The widely held theory of the hierarchy of genres in painting, whereby some types were regarded as more prestigious than others, led many painters to want to produce history painting. However, this was the hardest to sell, as even Rembrandt found. Many were forced to produce portraits or genre scenes, which sold much more easily. In descending order of status, the categories in the hierarchy were history painting, including allegories and popular religious subjects; portrait painting, including the trony, genre painting or scenes of everyday life; landscape, including seascapes, battle scenes, cityscapes, and ruins; still life. The Dutch concentrated heavily on the lower categories, but by no means rejected the concept of the hierarchy. Most paintings were relatively small. The only common type of really large paintings were group portraits. Painting directly onto walls hardly existed. When a wall space in a public building needed decorating, fitted framed canvas was normally used. For the extra precision possible on a hard surface, many painters continued to use wooden panels. Sometime after the rest of Western Europe had abandoned them, some used copper plates, usually recycling plates from printmaking. In turn, the number of surviving Golden Age paintings was reduced by them being overpainted with new works by artists throughout the 18th and 19th century. Poor ones were usually cheaper than a new canvas, stretcher and frame. There was very little Dutch sculpture during the period. It is mostly found in tomb monuments and attached to public buildings, and small sculptures for houses are a noticeable gap, their place taken by silverware and ceramics. Painted Delftware tiles were very cheap and common, if rarely of really high quality, but silver, especially in the auricular style, led Europe. With this exception, the best artistic efforts were concentrated on painting and printmaking. The art world. Foreigners remarked on the enormous quantities of art produced, and the large fairs where many paintings were sold. It has been roughly estimated that over 1.3 million Dutch pictures were painted in the 20 years After 1640 alone, the volume of production meant that prices were fairly low, except for the best-known artists. As in most subsequent periods, there was a steep price gradient for more fashionable artists, those without a strong contemporary reputation or fallen out of fashion, including many now considered among the greatest of the period, such as Vermeer. Frans Hals and Rembrandt in his last years had considerable problems earning a living, and died poor. Many artists had other jobs, or abandoned art entirely. In particular, the French invasion of 1672 brought a severe depression to the art market, which never quite returned to earlier heights. The distribution of pictures was very wide. Yea, many times blacksmithists, cobblers etc. will have some picture or other by their forge and in their stall. Such is the general notion, inclination and delight that these country native have to painting, reported an English traveller in 1640. There were for virtually the first time many professional art dealers, several also significant artists, like Vermeer and his father, Jan van Goyen and Willem Kalf. Rembrandt's dealer Hendrik van Eilenberg and his son Gerard were among the most important. Landscapes were the easiest uncommissioned works to sell, and the painters were the common footmen in the army of art. According to Samuel van Hoogstraten, the technical quality of Dutch artists was generally very high, still mostly following the old medieval system of training by apprenticeship with a master. Typically workshops were smaller than in Flanders or Italy, with only 1 or 2 apprentices at a time, the number often being restricted by guild regulations. The turmoil of the early years of the Republic, with displaced artists from the south moving north and the loss of traditional markets in the court and church, led to a resurgence of artists' guilds, often still called the Guild of St. Luc. In many cases these involved the artists extricating themselves from medieval groupings where they shared a guild with several other trades, such as house painting. Several new guilds were established in the period: Amsterdam in 1579, Haarlem in 1590, and Gouda, Rotterdam, Utrecht and Delft between 1609 and 1611. The Leiden authorities distrusted guilds and did not allow one until 1648. Later in the century it began to become clear to all involved that the old idea of a guild controlling both training and sales no longer worked well, and gradually the guilds were replaced with academies, often only concerned with the training of artists. The Hague, with the court, was an early example, where artists split into 2 groups in 1656 with the founding of the Comfrey Pictura, with the obvious exception of portraits. Many more Dutch paintings were done speculatively, without a specific commission than was then the case in other countries, one of many ways in which the Dutch art market showed the future. There were many dynasties of artists, and many married the daughters of their masters or other artists. Many artists came from well-off families, who paid fees for their apprenticeships, and they often married into property. Rembrandt and Jan Steen were both enrolled at the University of Leiden for a while. Several cities had distinct styles and specialities by subject, but Amsterdam was the largest artistic center, because of its great wealth. Cities such as Haarlem and Utrecht were more important in the first half of the century, with Leiden and other cities emerging after 1648, and above all Amsterdam, which increasingly drew to it artists from the rest of the Netherlands, as well as Flanders and Germany. Dutch artists were strikingly less concerned about artistic theory than those of many nations, and less given to discussing their art. It appears that there was also much less interest in artistic theory in general intellectual circles and among the wider public than was by then common in Italy, as nearly all commissions and sales were private, and between bourgeois individuals whose accounts have not been preserved. These are also less well documented than elsewhere. But Dutch art was a source of national pride, and the major biographers are crucial sources of information. These are Karel van Mander, who essentially covers the previous century, and Arnold Houbraken. Both followed, and indeed exceeded, Vasarian, including a great number of short lives of artists, over 500 in Hobbeken's case, and both are considered generally accurate on factual matters. The German artist Joachim von Sandrit had worked for periods in Holland, and his Deutsche Academy in the same format covers many Dutch artists he knew. Hobbeken's master, and Rembrandt's pupil, was Samuel van Hoogstraten, whose Zichtbaarwelden inleiding tot der Hogeschool der Schilderkunst contain more critical than biographical information, and are among the most important treatises on painting of the period. Like other Dutch works on the theory of art, they expound many commonplaces of Renaissance theory and do not entirely reflect contemporary Dutch art, still often concentrating on history painting. History painting. This category comprises not only paintings that depicted historical events of the past, but also paintings that showed biblical, mythological, literary and allegorical scenes. Recent historical events essentially fell out of the category, and were treated in a realist fashion, as the appropriate combination of portraits with marine, townscape or landscape subjects. Large dramatic, historical or biblical scenes were produced less frequently than in other countries, as there was no local market for church art, and few large aristocratic Baroque houses to fill. More than that, the Protestant population of major cities had been exposed to some remarkably hypocritical uses of Mannerist allegory and unsuccessful Habsburg propaganda during the Dutch Revolt, which had produced a strong reaction towards realism and a distrust of grandiose visual rhetoric. History painting was now a minority art, although to an extent this was redressed by a relatively keen interest in print versions of history subjects more than in other types of painting. Dutch history painters continued to be influenced by Italian painting. Prints and copies of Italian masterpieces circulated and suggested certain compositional schemes. The growing Dutch skill in the depiction of light was brought to bear on styles derived from Italy, notably that of Caravaggio. Some Dutch painters also travelled to Italy, though this was less common than with their Flemish contemporaries, as can be seen from the membership of the Bentvueghels Club in Rome. In the early part of the century, many Northern Mannerist artists with styles formed in the previous century continued to work until the 1630s in the cases of Abraham Bloemaert and Joachim W. T. Weyl. Many history paintings were small in scale, with the German painter Adam Elsheimer as much an influence as Caravaggio on Dutch painters like Peter Lastman, Rembrandt's master, and Jan and Jacob Pinus. Compared to Baroque history painting from other countries, they shared the Dutch emphasis on realism and narrative directness, and are sometimes known as the pre-Rembrandtists, as Rembrandt's early paintings were in this style. Utrecht Caravaggism describes a group of artists who produce both history painting and generally large genre scenes in an Italian-influenced style, often making heavy use of chiaroscuro. Utrecht, before the revolt the most important city in the new Dutch territory, was an unusual Dutch city. Still about 40% Catholic in the mid-century, even more among the elite groups, who included many rural nobility and gentry with town houses there. The leading artists were Hendrik ter Bruggen, Gerard van Honthorst and Dirk van Baburen, and the school was active about 1630. Although Van Honthorst continued until the 1650s as a successful court painter to the English, Dutch and Danish courts in a more classical style, Rembrandt began as a history painter before finding financial success as a portraitist, and he never relinquished his ambitions in this area. A great number of his etchings are of narrative religious scenes, and the story of his last history commission, The Conspiracy of Claudius Civilis, illustrates both his commitment to the form and the difficulties he had in finding an audience. Several artists, many his pupils, attempted with some success to continue his very personal style. Govert Flinck was the most successful. Gerard De La Risa was another of these, before falling under heavy influence from French classicism, and becoming its leading Dutch proponent as both artist and theoretician. Nudity was effectively the preserve of the history painter, although many portraitists dressed up their occasional nudes with a classical title, as Rembrandt did. For all their uninhibited suggestiveness, genre painters rarely revealed more than a generous cleavage or stretch of thigh, usually when painting prostitutes or Italian peasants.